They reset the calendar. What they erased from your true past, 1582. The date was October 4th, 1582. And then it wasn't. That's the part that stopped me. Not the politics. Not the astronomy. The simple, almost incomprehensible fact that on the morning of October 4th, 1582, millions of people across Catholic Europe went to sleep, and when they woke up, it was October 15th. 10 days had been removed from the calendar by papal decree. 10 days that, officially, never happened. 10 days that, depending on which historian you ask, either corrected a minor astronomical drift or erased something that certain people very badly needed erased. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was looking into the Gregorian reform for what I thought would be a footnote. It became 6 weeks of research. It became this. The calendar reform of 1582 is taught in schools as a triumph of rationality. Pope Gregory XIII, advised by the Jesuit astronomer Christopher Clavius, corrected a 10-day drift that had accumulated in the old Julian calendar since 45 BC. The spring equinox had been slipping. Easter was migrating. The fix was elegant. Remove 10 days in October. Adjust the leap year rule going forward. Rational. Tidy. Necessary. But here's what no one explains. The 10 days chosen weren't random. The documents that justified the reform, including the papal bull Inter Gravissimus, issued February 24, 1582, now held in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, explain the astronomical correction in careful, precise language. What they don't explain is what was happening in those 10 missing days. What records, what debts, what legal proceedings, what births, what deaths, what land transfers simply ceased to exist in the official timeline. What they don't explain is why certain nations refused the reform for over a century, and what the true cost of that refusal turned out to be. And what they don't explain is the pattern that emerges when you look at which records from the pre-reform period are now incomplete, inaccessible, or simply gone. I don't have answers, only patterns. But the patterns, I think, are worth your time. Let's start with the numbers. The Julian calendar was introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, based on the calculations of the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes. It assumed a solar year of exactly 365.25 days. The actual solar year is approximately 365.2422 days. That difference, 11 minutes and 14 seconds per year, seems negligible. But compounded across 15 centuries, it produces a drift of roughly 10 days. By 1582, the spring equinox was falling on March 11th instead of March 21st, where the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD had fixed it for the purpose of calculating Easter. This is the official explanation for the reform, and it is technically correct. I want to be clear about that. The astronomical problem was real. Christopher Clavius was a serious and credible scientist, later defended by none other than Galileo himself. The math of the reform is sound, but the timing is almost theatrical. The reform came in 1582. Specifically, it came after the Council of Trent. The Catholic Church's formal response to the Protestant Reformation had concluded in 1563. It came as the Church was in the most aggressive phase of its Counter-Reformation, actively working to reassert spiritual and temporal authority across Europe. It came as vast quantities of land, money, and political legitimacy had been redistributed during the upheavals of the previous 60 years. The dissolution of English monasteries under Henry VIII, the Schmalkaldic Wars, the French Wars of Religion, all of which had involved the seizure, transfer, and often destruction of medieval land records, church records, and feudal documentation. Into that specific context, a context of maximum documentary chaos, maximum institutional disruption, maximum ambiguity about who owned what and who owed whom, came the declaration that 10 days of history would be removed. Officially, retroactively, never to be counted. The timeline isn't subtle. Speaking of documents, let me tell you what happened to the records. In medieval Europe, legal and financial life was organized around the church calendar in ways that are difficult to appreciate from a modern vantage point. Debts fell due on feast days. Contracts were dated by saints' days. Court proceedings were scheduled around liturgical observances. The calendar wasn't just a system for tracking time. It was the operating system of civil society, which means that removing 10 days from the calendar wasn't just an astronomical correction. It was a legal event. It was an economic event. Contracts that matured during the removed days were suddenly in an ambiguous state. Was October 7th, 1582, a valid legal date? In Italy, where the reform was adopted immediately, no, that day ceased to exist. In England, which would not adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752, yes, October 7th, 1582, was a perfectly normal Tuesday. This created, for the first time in European history, a situation in which two nations operating simultaneously could genuinely disagree about what date it was, not by a few hours, not due to time zones, but by an entire week and a half. Historians of the period have noted this calendrical schism casually, as a minor inconvenience. What they note less often is what it meant for the resolution of trans-European legal and financial disputes in the decades that followed. I spent time in the digitized records of the calendar collection at the British Library. The collection holds correspondence from merchants, lawyers, and diplomats navigating the dual calendar problem throughout the late 16th and 17th centuries. What struck me was how frequently, in these letters, parties to a dispute claimed that a critical event, a delivery, a payment, a death, a signing, had occurred on a date that, depending on which calendar system you applied, either fell within or outside the legally operative window. This wasn't fraud in most cases. It was genuine confusion. But that confusion, in case after case, appears to have resolved in the favor of the more powerful party to the dispute. Maybe that's coincidence. Maybe the more powerful party simply had better lawyers. But here's what matters. There is no central archive of the disputes that were decided on the basis of calendrical confusion during the Reform transition period. There is no catalog of which claims were extinguished, which debts dissolved, which inheritance proceedings were disrupted by the sudden 10-day gap. Those records, to the extent they existed, lived in local courts, in notarial records, in ecclesiastical tribunals. Many of those courts were themselves in the middle of institutional upheaval. The records are scattered. In many cases, they are gone. Which brings me to the deeper question, the one that took me 6 weeks to formulate properly. We speak of the Gregorian reform as a single event. The papal bull was issued on February 24th, 1582. The change was enacted in October. But what we don't speak about as clearly is what happened before the reform, specifically, the decade-long preparation and the records it generated, and what happened to those records afterward. Christopher Clavius and his colleagues at the Collegio Romano, the Jesuit institution in Rome that served as the intellectual engine of the Counter-Reformation, worked on the calendar reform project for years before the 1582 announcement. The primary documentation of that preparatory work is held in the Archivum Romanum Societatis Jesu, the central archive of the Jesuit order in Rome. A portion of those records is accessible to scholars by appointment. A portion is described in finding aids, but has not been physically located. A portion is listed as damaged or destroyed in a fire at the archive in 1873. The 1873 fire. I keep returning to it. It destroyed records from the 16th and 17th centuries, precisely the period in question. The archive's own documentation of what was lost is, by the archive's own admission, incomplete, because the inventory records for the destroyed section were themselves lost in the same fire. We know what's missing because of references in surviving documents to records that no longer exist. We are reading shadows. That's not negligence. That's not a conspiracy, necessarily. Fires happen. Archives are imperfect. But I want you to hold the following facts in your mind at the same time. The primary preparatory records for the most significant reorganization of the Western European timeline are partially missing, destroyed in a fire whose extent cannot be fully established, at an archive that restricts public access to its remaining holdings, during a period when the institution that holds those records was itself at the center of one of the most aggressive campaigns of political and cultural control in early modern history. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, but the pattern keeps appearing in the same shape. Let me tell you about the nations that refused. Protestant Europe did not adopt the Gregorian calendar in 1582. England waited until 1752. Sweden adopted it in 1753 after a botched partial implementation created years of additional confusion. Russia didn't adopt it until 1918, following the Bolshevik Revolution, which is why the October Revolution is celebrated in November. The Orthodox churches maintain the Julian calendar to this day for liturgical purposes. The official explanation for these delays is religious and political. Protestant nations refused to adopt a reform issued by the Pope. Simple as that. The calendar became a marker of confessional identity. Julian calendar for Protestants, Gregorian calendar for Catholics. That explanation is real. I don't dispute it. But here's what no one explains about the 170-year gap in England's adoption. When England finally converted in 1752, the legal provision governing the change was the Calendar, New Style, Act of 1750, which received royal assent and took effect September 2nd, 1752. The next day was September 14th, 11 days removed, one more than in 1582, because an additional leap year had been misapplied in the intervening century. The Act contained specific provisions about how to handle legal contracts, financial obligations, and property rights that straddled the conversion date. Those provisions were debated in Parliament for 2 years. The records of those parliamentary debates are held in Hansard, the official record of parliamentary proceedings, and they are available digitally. I read them. The debates are not primarily about astronomy. They are about money. Specifically, they are about whether annuities, rents, interest payments, and lease terms calculated in Julian dates should be converted directly to Gregorian equivalents, which would mean creditors receive their payments 11 days earlier, or whether the payment dates should remain fixed to the calendar day, which would effectively give debtors 11 additional days of grace. The final act split the difference in ways that, the record suggests, were not uniformly understood or applied. The result was years of litigation. The case law from 1752 to 1760 in English courts contains hundreds of disputes arising directly from calendrical ambiguity about when a payment or obligation fell due. Most of those cases were resolved in favor of landowners and institutional creditors, the entities that had the resources to pursue them through the courts. That's not a conspiracy. That is how power works. But I want you to notice that every time a calendar changes, the confusion is resolved in a direction, and the direction is not random. Now let me tell you about 1582 and what was buried in plain sight. The papal bull Inter Gravissimus is a remarkable document. I found a digitized copy through the Vatican Apostolic Archives online portal, where a portion of the historic papal documents have been made available since 2020. The bull is primarily concerned with Easter. It is, on its surface, a liturgical document. But buried in its provisions is something that has received almost no attention outside of specialized ecclesiastical history, a clause addressing the validity of records dated during the removed days. The clause is brief. It states, in the original Latin, that acts performed during the removed days would be considered valid as if performed on the adjoining dates, either October 4th or October 15th, depending on their nature. The determination of which adjoining date applied was left to local ecclesiastical and civil authorities. This sounds administrative. It may have been purely administrative, but consider what that discretion meant in practice. In any given diocese, in any given court, in any given notarial office across Catholic Europe, local authorities had the power to decide whether a document dated October 8, 1582, a date that no longer officially existed, would be treated as if it had been executed on October 4th or on October 15th. That is an 11-day window of discretion. In a world where interest accrued daily, where lease terms were calculated to the day, where inheritance claims depended on the precise sequence of deaths within a family, 11 days of discretion in the hands of local authorities is not a minor administrative detail. It is a lever, and levers do not stay unused. I am not claiming I can prove the lever was systematically pulled. I cannot. The local records in which that discretion was exercised are, in most cases, scattered across municipal and diocesan archives in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Poland that have never been comprehensively cross-referenced. Some of those archives are closed to outside researchers. Some were damaged in the wars of the 20th century. Some simply were never systematically inventoried. The part that keeps me up at night is this: the lever existed. It was put there by the same document that created the gap, and the people W. But the pattern keeps taking the same shape. The mechanism of confusion is created, the confusion is resolved in the favor of institutional power, and the records that would allow us to trace exactly who lost what and who gained it are incomplete, inaccessible, or gone. Here is what remains. Inter Gravissimas is still in the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Some of it is digitized. The preparatory correspondence is not fully accessible. The 1873 Jesuit archive fire-destroyed records, whose full scope we cannot establish. The parliamentary debates of 1750 are enhanced, if you know where to look. The local notarial records of Catholic Europe from October 1582 are scattered across dozens of archives in 6 countries. Some have never been catalogued. Some are deteriorating. The cross-reference study that would trace the financial and legal effects of the 10-day removal, diocese by diocese, court by court, has never been written. Not because it couldn't be written, the source material exists, fragmentarily, but because it requires an interdisciplinary effort that no institution has yet funded. Maybe it would find nothing. Maybe every local authority handled the transition fairly. Maybe the lever was never pulled. But the lever was there. The document proves it. And the records that would tell us definitively whether it was pulled are the same records that don't fully exist. There is one last thing. In 1582, the day that was chosen to disappear first, the day after which the 10 missing days began, was October 4th, the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, the saint who, in Catholic tradition, is associated most closely with poverty, with humility, and with the renunciation of property and earthly wealth. The calendar reform erased the 10 days that followed the feast of the Saint of Poverty. What came after those 10 days, on October 15th, was the new calendar, the new accounting, the new record of what existed and when. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if it means anything. But I have not been able to stop thinking about it since I found it, buried in a footnote, in a 1934 scholarly commentary on the Gregorian reform that was sitting in a university library catalog that almost no one visits anymore. The archive still exists. Some of it. Enough to ask the question. They reset the calendar. And in the resetting, the past became whatever the new present needed it to be. I don't have answers. Only patterns. And the pattern, this time, is 10 days wide.